am not surprised watching Democrats silent when there's violence going on, as long as it's violence to pursue a cause they like. Remember the summer of 2020, the George Floyd BLM protests and riots that resulted in 25 people killed, 2,000 police officers injured. On January 6th, they love police officers. Outside of January 6th, couldn't care less. $2 billion in insured property damage, maybe another billion or so in uninsured property damage. Not only was there no widespread condemnation of this, but Kamala Harris, and Mr. McConnell, let's see if we have this. I think it was on the Colbert Show. Goes on the Colbert Show during the time these riots were taking place. And she said they're not going to stop, and they should not stop. She even retweeted a tweet that had a fund that you could contribute to bail out some of the protesters who got arrested. Was there widespread condemnation of the violence?
I made a very conscious decision to become a prosecutor. I grew up in a community that was not always on the best end of law enforcement in terms of how the laws were applied. There's not a black man I know, be he a relative or a friend, who has not been the subject of some form of racial profiling or excessive force. So when I made a decision to become a prosecutor, it was a conscious decision, which was to go inside the system and have some leverage there to effectuate change. I say that to say this. The only way we're going to truly achieve change is when there are people in the system who are willing or pushing to do it, and when there are those folks who are outside of the system demanding it. I am very clear that some of the success that we've been able to achieve around criminal justice reform would not have happened in recent years were it not for Black Lives Matter. And the intensity and the brilliance of that movement that forced at least that there would be some counterforce to the status quo, which is so reluctant for change, if not hostile to change. That's what these movements do. That where these systems are so invested and ingrained in what they call tradition, but is status quo, often which can be wrong-headed, these movements provide a counterforce to get us to where we need to be.
So even what some might call weak tea proposals by the Republicans right now wouldn't be happening if there weren't these protests in the streets.
I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it. And it's tragic because the reality is that these protests have been happening in maybe smaller form for generations, but let's just look at where we are right now and acknowledge, to your point, yeah, had these protests, had people by the hundreds of thousands not been out there marching, many who might be relatives of those very people who have been obstructionists until now, we probably wouldn't be where we are. But again, back to where we are, what the Republicans are proposing is by many accounts, and certainly by my account, absolutely insufficient to meet this moment. And we need to go with the Justice and Policing bill.
And I want to make clear that I know that there are protests still happening in major cities across the United States. I'm just not seeing the reporting on it that I had
that's right.
for the first few weeks.
That's right. But they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop. And they're not. This is a movement. I'm telling you, they're not going to stop. And everyone beware, because they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop before Election Day in November, and they're not going to stop after Election Day. And that should be, everyone should take note of that on both levels, that this isn't, they're not going to let up, and they should not, and we should not.
So not only was there no condemnation of these violent protests, but she fanned the flames. And that's exactly what's happening with respect to these Tesla car owners who are finding their cars set on fire or keyed or defaced, dealerships firebombed. And regarding the BLM movement that she embraced and that Obama embraced, remember why it started. It started because of the death of Trayvon Martin. Do you remember the jury verdict in that case? They found George Zimmerman, who shot and killed him, not guilty by reason of self-defense. It was a jury that had no blacks, but there was a black alternate, and that alternate agreed with the verdict. You're comparing the death of Trayvon Martin to the civil rights movement of the 60s, are you smoking something? How many times do we have to go over this? The data has shown for a long time that cops are more hesitant, more reluctant to pull the trigger on a black suspect than a white suspect. The George Floyd riots of 2020 took place because of an assumption that what happened to George Floyd had to do with his race. And I've said many times that the lead prosecutor, who happened to be black, never even suggested that Derek Chauvin was motivated by George Floyd's race. The most important part of a trial is the opening statement, and he never even implied that Derek Chauvin was motivated by George Floyd's race. Derek Chauvin, the officer in question, was never even charged with a hate crime. So you had hundreds of cities, millions of protesters, some of whom engaging in violence, some of whom doing property damage, all because of an assumption that what happened to George Floyd had to do with his race when there is zero evidence of it. This is disgusting. Zero evidence of it. And you know what happened? What happened was something called the George Floyd effect. And that's the phenomenon of cops pulling back from their normal proactive policing, where you're cruising around, you see something that looks suspicious, you get out of your car to investigate. What's the upside in doing that? Someone will whip out a cell phone, not shoot it from the beginning. Next thing you know, you're in the nightly news for allegedly engaging in an act of violence against a black person because you're, of course, a racist. So cops all over the country pull back. There was a large paper done by this by a guy named Zach Kriegman, who was a data scientist with Reuters. And he looked at all these cities that had had these high-profile shootings of suspects by cops and noticed something. Every time it happened, violent crime went up, and disproportionately the victims of that violent crime were the very black and brown people that people like Kamala Harris purport to care about. So not only is she wrong, she's doing a great deal of damage to the very people that she purports to care about, and it is absolutely disgusting. We come back, we're going to talk about the attack on Tesla dealerships and those who own Teslas, and the boycott now against Teslas. I thought the left cared about climate change. So much for that.
For full shows, live and on demand, it's Salem News Channel.